Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Gideon Rose. I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs. I want to welcome you to this edition of Foreign Affairs Live. Before we get started, I want to thank DevEx, our media partner for this event, with the tagline, "Do good and do it well." DevEx is the premier online home for international development news, networking, and jobs. So you should go see their site and check out their offerings, and it's really impressive stuff. Thanks also to our DC area CFR members and Foreign Affairs subscribers for attending. And a couple of notes on housekeeping. First, please silence or turn off your electronic devices, although if you want, you are now free at these events to tweet, to follow the discussion online at the Twitter hashtag FALive. Just don't make anything loud or interruptions. We'll be posting a video of tonight's panel on our site and on our YouTube channel to keep the discussion going, so you can tell your friends and they can watch it there. We also welcome you to join us for a reception outside once we conclude the Q&A session. With that, let me just get right to our panel. We have two spectacular guests with us tonight. Nancy Birdsall, the founding president of the Center for Global Development, who was the author of a wonderful piece, co-author with Frank Fukuyama, in our March-April issue, The Post-Washington Consensus, and Susan Schwab, who is now a professor at the University of Maryland and former USTR, who is the author of another spectacular piece, After Doha, in our May-June issue. I guess what I would say is that the new Foreign Affairs is all about sort of provocative and interesting stuff, and the idea that the head of the Center of Global Development would be pushing something that smells suspiciously like social democracy, and the former U.S. trade representative would call for killing off a trade round. This is actually rather provocative stuff as these issues go, and I'm delighted to be able to get into it with them here. What we're going to do is talk a little bit about their pieces and then about some of the broader meta issues about international development policy, international economic policy, and global governance in a world with more dispersed and differentiated power in which the leading economies in the United States can't simply command, and a world in which neoliberalism and liberalism more generally in the economic sphere is under increasing skeptical attack. So with that, let me ask Nancy just to kick it off by saying a few words about what your piece said.
Okay, thank you very much, Gideon. It's fun to be here, and it's fun to be here with Susan, and to see some development friends in the crowd as well. Well, this piece really is about changing ideas in the developing world, and how those changing ideas are being reinforced by what happened to the US and the UK, but particularly starting in the US with the global financial crisis. One way to summarize it is that the global financial crisis, we may look back in 5 or 10 years or even more and say that was the moment when the American version of cowboy capitalism, to exaggerate a little, was knocked off its pedestal. And what are the implications for the way the rest of the world, including rising Asia, including China, but also Africa, Latin America, the poor countries of Asia, what are the implications for the way that they'll proceed, both in their domestic policies and in their role in the world? So just very quickly on domestic policies, Gideon referred to the social welfare state. The point that we make in this piece, and that I made in the introduction to a book that Frank and I edited together, is that the financial crisis showed people and governments around the developing world that this is a dangerous, there's a lot of volatility, that what is needed is a robust response to the very high risks that globalization poses. Globalization brings benefits, but it also poses these risks. And that if you want to have social stability, you better be thinking about ensuring that you don't lose a lot of jobs when there's a crisis, that you don't get in trouble politically when food prices suddenly rise or oil prices suddenly fall, etc. So that's the part about, I think it was probably Gideon or someone at Foreign Affairs who just suggested we call this section Caring About Caring. We also point out that, and this is important for in terms of where China is and how the US and China relations are evolving, that for many countries in the developing world, one lesson from the crisis might appear to be that it's a lot easier to respond when you have a more autocratic system, as happened in China, than, for example, in the case of India, where, you know, democracy is a bit messy. And this is actually potentially important in many countries in Africa. Will the part of what takes America off its pedestal will the lesson be about sort of democratic accountability and not just about economic arrangements? One other point I'll make is that the crisis ended what Arvind Subramanian, who's a colleague of mine at the Center for Global Development and the Peterson Institute, really wonderfully labeled the foreign finance fetish. And this is the idea that financial flows, the more you have, the better. And this comes from way back in the days of the Clinton Treasury and the IMF in the 90s, right through really the last few years, that overall capital flows, money flying around the world is a good thing. And so what we're suggesting is that that's another piece of the American approach to a very market-driven system that may be questioned increasingly in the developing world. All this in the context of a continued allegiance to the fundamental idea that capitalism is the right economic system, that markets work, but state-managed markets a little bit more than free markets in the traditional American sense. Maybe I should stop there.
Okay. Susan, for over 6 decades, the WTO and the predecessors have been essentially, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, have been trying to promote more trade flowing around the world. There's been, if not a financial fetish, then at least a trade fetish. But but the Doha round ran aground, and you called for it to be euthanized, put out of its misery. What is the stuff that that Susan was talking about? Does that mean that we're looking, and the stuff that you're talking about in your piece, does that mean we're looking at the end of freer trade and progress towards it?
I don't want to believe that, and I don't actually believe that. At the core, this piece was designed to be a sort of emperor has no clothes commentary to promote a more, call it robust discussion about the future of the Doha round. I wrote it from the perspective of one who believes in markets, believes that multilateral trade agreements and WTO hosted trade negotiations are healthier ultimately than trade preferences, than bilateral or regional deals. Even though I'm very proud of the bilateral free trade agreements that I was able to negotiate in my role as USTR in the Bush administration. Ultimately, the sense that I wanted to impart was that no matter how much we would want the Doha round to succeed, and I feel like I spent 30 years of my tenure working on the Doha round, that unfortunately it doesn't look as though it will. And it is nobody's fault and everybody's fault, and that pretending that the Doha round will succeed is in fact at this point in time jeopardizing the multilateral trading system and the future of multilateral trade negotiations, which I do not dismiss as a viable path for the future. One of the, what are the reasons for that? There are a whole variety of reasons that I lay out, but ultimately this is a negotiation that was designed in the 1990s. It was designed, arguably it failed before it started in 1999 with the Seattle trade ministerial. When it was actually launched in 2001, they couldn't even agree to call it a round. They called it a Doha Development Agenda, and the definition of development was never clear. For some, the definition of development was developed countries have to open their markets, developing countries would not need to. For others, it was a recognition that today Almost half of global GDP is accounted for by countries that are not OECD countries, that are emerging markets, developing countries, and that those markets are growing twice as fast as developed country markets. And unless and until you have a structure and a negotiation that reflects the fact that if you're going to get a bang for your buck in a multilateral negotiation, you need to generate more trade flows, to generate economic growth from a trade agreement. And to generate more trade flows, you need to open markets, and you need to open the fastest growing markets, namely the emerging markets, Brazil, China, India, and so on. And so the question then that I try to address is, how can you get there? Is there something you could do to save the Doha round? If not, what can you do to make sure that the WTO and the multilateral structure is still there? Because it's an incredibly valuable structure. And the challenge with the Doha round is not that it's too big, but that it's too small.
Okay, one of the things we've supposedly learned over the last couple of generations is that closed societies and closed economies stagnate and fail, and a siloed economic world doesn't grow. And now it seems like the other counterpart to that is that overly open, overly churning systems, both domestically and internationally, have their own problems. Where does this leave questions about capitalism, both on a national level and an international level going forward? I mean, as you say, Susan, you were saying that nobody has rejected capitalism to court after this crisis the way one might have expected from previous crises. But they've pulled back from some of the more wild and crazy versions of it. And you say that, okay, the round may have failed, but we need to salvage what's there and try to move on to the next one. So in this world in which there's now more power dispersed and everybody has a say and a veto, what does this messy new world look like?
Well, I would note that the countries that we look at today that are growing most rapidly are growing most rapidly in large measure because they have large populations and they opened their markets in the 1990s. That they adopted reforms, whether at the border or internally, that were market-oriented reforms, and quite frankly, their successes today and the economic development today is more attributable to that than any kind of industrial policy that any of them have undertaken since then. So I think it is much too early to say, oh, we've got a, there's a new model. In answer to your question, market economics is the worst form of economics except for every other form of economics. And the question then is the extremes, and there are individuals like Nancy Birdsall, like Carmen Reinhart, Ken Rogoff, who early on said there are problems inherent in hot money sloshing around, for example. And the IMF suggesting in the late 90s that countries should run current account surpluses. Well, not everyone can run current account surpluses, and so you run up against this disconnect. So anyway, that's sort of the fundamental point.
Let me turn around your comment, Gideon, and put it this way, that I think the spirit behind a lot of what Susan is saying and what Frank and I were saying in this piece is what we have a kind of emerging crisis in the world of collective action. Capitalism and markets are working. So some of the in the post-Washington consensus is what countries will do in their own domestic economic and political policies and approaches. But some of it is, how are we going to deal with, at the global collective level, a changing world? And I see two, issues that are troubling, frankly. One is that because the U.S. is in a kind of beleaguered position right now, post-crisis, with, if not a recession, many problems, the fiscal debt, unemployment, et cetera. As a country, I don't think we're taking the kind of leadership that was quite normal in much of the 20th century. Leadership on furthering an international liberal order where rules of the game were shaped in a sensible way, where all countries could benefit. So Susan's article is a little bit about the US is not there taking strong leadership right now on the multilateral trade, the Doha round. So that's one of the problems. The other problem that's related to that is the countries that are growing very quickly, especially China, have not yet, I don't think they're close to assuming that kind of role. They're maybe in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So in some of the work that lay behind the article in Foreign Affairs, I discussed some of the issues like climate change, which are very fundamental on the development agenda, but which it's hard to see how, as a global collective or cooperative society, we're going to really manage tackling those issues without the kind of leadership that the US had when it was not just a superpower, it was kind of a hyperpower in much of the Cold War period.
And I would build on what Nancy is saying in that it's not just a question of leadership. The references to the U.S. as the indispensable nation. Not only is no other country stepping up to lead, there's a real gap in terms of countries stepping up to contribute. And that's where the Doha round, for example, falls apart, where if in fact to generate economic growth, particularly for developing countries, you want to see more so-called South-South trade, and yet you're dealing with a Doha negotiating framework that is not going to deliver market opening in the largest, fastest growing developing countries. The question is, what should those countries be expected to contribute to the greater, to the greater good? When they look at their own problems, and they still have very, very significant problems. They still have very significant poverty. But if you differentiate between having several 100 million people who are indeed in dire straits in terms of any definition, by any definition of poverty, next to a global powerhouse in the manufacture of textiles and apparel, the manufacture of steel, the manufacture increasingly of autos. And you have to, what we're dealing with are sort of mixed market economies that have not yet reconciled themselves or don't yet feel the obligation. So you got a lot of countries that are just terribly self-absorbed, developed and developing, to the detriment of all of us.
Yeah.
One thing I want to say about this, and it's just a little factoid, but it's interesting in the context of this discussion, provoked by what Susan just said. There is, for those of you who are developmentistas, you'll know that one of the Millennium Development Goals, it's not much discussed, is that the rich countries and the advanced developing countries, the BRICS and so on, would provide duty-free, quota-free access for all products without complicated rules of origin for the least developed countries, which is a United Nations category that includes really the poorest, most vulnerable countries in the world. One of the things that's very interesting is that work of a colleague of mine at the center and discussions about that initiative for duty-free, quota-free access is that Brazil, India, Turkey, and several other emerging market economies have started introducing in their own domestic legislatures provisions that they will gradually open their market to these least developed countries. So we, from the center, we push this pretty hard for the G20 Seoul agenda because the Koreans also were making some positive noises about this. Which was the country that put the kibosh on this initiative? The United States of America. So I think we have to, if the things are changing.
And why? What was the argument that was put forward?
I think it was just that there were some good arguments. There's concern that just at the moment when the Obama administration was moving on Korea, Colombia, Panama. To introduce something else that might irritate some members of Congress would not be smart. But I think more fundamentally, there's just always a hesitation on the part of an administration in a country with the separation of powers. And now we're back to, you know, the benefits of democracy, but the mess that it sometimes generates. There's just always that hesitation about pushing something that in the Congress will not be well received.
But let me offer an interesting
Susan knows all
add-on to
about
this.
that.
I mean, the duty-free, quota-free proposal is part of the Doha round negotiation. I mean, it's part of the Doha round. However, only for developed countries, not for developing countries.
Not for
Brazil, China, not for the emerging markets. And again, the challenge with the Doha round is you've got this dichotomy. You've got the responsibilities of the developed countries, the responsibility of the developing countries, and in essence, you have Brazil, India, China treated like Uganda, Kenya, and so on. So you've got, you know, the structure of the negotiation is such that there is no incentive for the emerging markets to put more on the table. So let's set that aside for a minute. Duty-free, quota-free is part of that negotiation. We had a steady stream of countries coming to us, quietly of course, developing countries, going, are you aware that Cambodia and Bangladesh are considered least developing countries? And if you open up textiles and apparel, both of them are powerhouse textile and apparel producers, and they're going to wipe out the benefits that the African, sub-Saharan African countries have from AGOA, which is a US program specifically for sub-Saharan African countries. So there's a lot of, these preference programs I think are very important, you know, for the least developing countries. But they aren't easy either, because you've got countries that have certain levels of preference. Take South Africa. South Africa has access to the generalized system of preferences in AGOA in the United States, has access to the European preference program. South Africa then has no incentive to push for, multilateralizing concessions. Because they have, quote, preference erosion. They would face preference erosion. So you've got, even with something as straightforward as duty-free, quota-free, and your Article 1, Section 8 challenges that you've got in terms of the Congress being the, you know, quote, the decision-making body on implementation of trade agreements, it's still not easy. And a lot of these developing countries, again, in textile and apparel, where we still have tariff peaks, a lot of these countries are still smarting from, ironically, the elimination of the multi-fiber agreement. You know, we used to have quotas on all of our textile and apparel imports, and as part of the last multilateral round, we decided to do away with them. And what happened was Chinese textile and apparel exports kind of wiped out a whole lot of other developing country textile and apparel production.
But Susan, if I can be a little snarky.
Of course.
That's not why the US didn't move on this initiative in the G20 context. You know, trade issues are complicated, the preference issue is complicated, but the bottom line that I still think, we're still in this, I would just go back to the fundamental point that we're missing US leadership, and we haven't got leadership yet from elsewhere, but maybe that will change.
Well, let's talk about that. You mentioned the G20. We've run a number of pieces recently, a nice one by Jorge Castaneda, a nice one by Stuart Patrick, one by Nouriel Roubini and Ian Bremer earlier this year, all of which basically have been painting this rather depressing picture of a world with more dispersed power. Because for all the hoopla and talk about bringing other people into global governance and incorporating new powers into the system, and being more inclusive, you know, we all know that with great power comes great responsibility, and yet, as you were saying, there is not necessarily a recognition of that among all these new powers, and so it's not at all clear how these global institutions and multilateral agreements and conventions will actually get anything done at all if you just have more people who have veto power and none of them are prepared to share this load. So when I hear you guys talk, on the one hand, it's not super depressing because it's not like there's some major new anti-liberal ideology or anti-capitalist ideology lurking around the corner waiting to take over. But it also looks like there's zero prospect for positive things moving forward in any kind of dynamic way.
Well, I don't think that the fundamental problem is too many players. I know that that's an important argument in the trade context where every country sort of had veto power. And it's also a complaint for people worrying about the climate negotiations. On the other hand, we have institutions where, I'm thinking of the IMF, the World Bank here in Washington, where there's a different way, you know, a different set of rules for distributing voice and power, and where there have been some steps to bring in the rising Asian economies and Brazil and so on a little bit more. The distribution of voting power is shifting very slowly. So my frustration, you know, I'm not totally frustrated. I think that things could work out, maybe a little more slowly than would be ideal. But to the extent I'm frustrated, it's much more that the US is not taking leadership.
When you say
on
taking
some
leadership,
issues.
what do you mean very specifically, concretely?
Well, what will happen if Dominique Strauss-Kahn leaves the IMF in the next several months because he may decide to go to France and run in the elections there, and that he would have to leave soon. Some of you will know that since, you know, the creation of the IMF and the World Bank, the Europeans have had a lockhold on the headship of the IMF and the US on the World Bank. There's been a lot of resolutions, including by the G20, that this needs to change, that the process of selecting a candidate should be open and transparent and should not...
Which of course means that no US candidate would ever get one of these positions.
I don't think so at all. The US would be able to prevent... No, I'm sorry, I misunderstood your joke. Okay, so I got mixed up. So anyway, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, suppose he leaves, then, you know, what we can imagine is the Europeans, maybe the Europeans feel some pressure to open up the process and have someone from Eastern Europe, you know, from Turkey, from India, on the slate, a candidate to head the IMF. But they won't do that if, when they call up to the US, the message is, oh, no, we're not going to ever, we can't do anything about that at the World Bank. It has to be a deal. So it's just a good example. Maybe the US will move a little, you know, in a direction that endorses the concept, anyway, of a more open, transparent process, the reality that the world is changing. Maybe it would make sense to have a Brazilian or an Indonesian or a Chinese, you know, in charge of climate discussions or climate transfers that are made by the multilateral banks. I don't know. That's the question. That's where I think the U.S. citizens could play a bigger role in backing multilateralism in its general form.
I'm going to go back to your previous question. Color me skeptical on the question of if we start doing musical chairs with some of these organizations, the prospect of, oh, an American heading up the WTO or UNDP or at the UN Secretary Generalship. I don't see it happening, but never mind. I'm actually optimistic that you can succeed at the WTO in getting a multilateral agreement, a multilateral trade liberalizing agreement where emerging markets put more on the table, or put more on the table relative to their level of development. I mean, the developed countries are still going to have to carry the bulk of these agreements, and there's no question about that. The question is, what will the emerging markets put on the table to help generate more, you know, trade flows, south-south, north-south? I think it's doable, And the point, in a way, of the article was to say, unfortunately, we are trapped in a 10-year-old construct in the Doha round, and we can't get out of it, and we can't fix it. Because the way it is structured, that specific negotiation is structured, there is no incentive for the emerging markets to put anything else on the table. It's hard, they can't do it. And as a negotiator, we worked with a variety of the developing country, emerging market leadership, and they would admit one-on-one, yes, we know we'd like to be able to do something, but every time we do, we get beaten up by our peers. You know, Brazil tried to break out 2008, they got beaten up by the Indians. China could consider breaking out and, you know, putting more on the table, and maybe they can only do it in the context of the G20, but they can't do it in the context of the current Doha round negotiating structure, because everything that they want from the developed countries is already on the table, so they don't want anything else. They don't need anything else from the developed countries, and therefore there's no negotiation. And why should these countries, you know, why should China, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, why should they negotiate with themselves? Because they're not going to gain anything from it. It's all there. So you could get, and it, you know, politically incorrect in a single undertaking where, you know, everything has to be agreed by everyone. You had a half a dozen, let's say at this point, a dozen countries in the room that wanted to get a multilateral deal done, and you moved away from the current construct, I still think it's doable. And I think it's more doable in the case of trade negotiations than, for example, in the case of climate. Yeah. Because in the case of trade negotiations, you can come back and point to all the things that you got for your constituents. A moment to talk as a market economist, we should be doing all this stuff unilaterally, right? All of these countries, I think, for the most part, whether it's, you know, eliminating export subsidies in agriculture, or trade distorting domestic subsidies, trade liberalization. Take services liberalization. Today, if you have access to the internet and you've got access to finance and you've got access to express package delivery, you could be a multinational from any country in the world. So you would think even the smallest developing country would unilaterally put in place the kind of infrastructure that we're seeking in services trade negotiations. And yet, countries come to trade negotiations, there's a difference between trade negotiators and classical economists, and maybe there's sort of this little mercantilist gene that's there where you think, okay, what is better than doing these reforms unilaterally? And the answer is leveraging my unilateral or my reforms to get somebody else's reforms at the same time. And you want to be able to point to new market access. But in a multilateral negotiation, in a way, it's easier than a bilateral or a regional deal, because you can point to all this. Yes, it's painful to do this. I'm sorry, constituent. Import-sensitive constituent, but look at all these things. You can build your own political mosaic. So I do not believe that it is impossible. I am concerned that the current construct will fail, and therefore the sooner we admit it and move to the next construct, the better.
Damon Runyon had a saying, the race is not always to the swift nor the battle to the strong, but that's the way to bet. So it might not be impossible or destined to fail, but I must say, I'm listening to you guys, I don't get more optimistic. At this point, I want to broaden the conversation, and let me kick it off with a pair of questions from Facebook. One for Susan. It's from
Nancy. Nancy, you keep calling me Susan.
What did I? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Oh, maybe it is for Susan.
No, there is one is for Susan. It's from Kilimo Hezron, which is. How will the upheavals in the Middle East and North Africa affect trade, if at all? We hear all the spring, we've been hearing about these world historical events. Is this connected to, or will have implications for trade in any significant way? And for Nancy, this is one from Adeline Guerra, which is, you talked about the financial flows. What do you think of the idea of a financial transaction tax? Is that something that would help least developed countries or be worthwhile? So Susan first, then Nancy.
In terms of the immediate negotiations, limited impact. The countries involved have been not the most active players in the multilateral trading system in the WTO. That said, Pakistan and Turkey and Egypt have generally been very positive contributors to trying to come up with innovative, interesting bridges between emerging markets and developed countries in the negotiations. And to the extent that Pakistan, with its current concerns, Egypt and Turkey paying attention and being very much involved with all of this, to the extent that they are not actively engaged, that's a loss to the negotiating structure. But keep in mind, WTO, you've got 153 countries involved, and the countries that tend to be the most influential are the largest markets, the largest producers, largest trading countries, and then you've got blocks of other countries. And for example, Pakistan is part of the Cairns group. Egypt has been part of the Africa group, so they take leadership roles within that context.
Nancy?
Financial transactions tax. Well, let me put it in a larger context. I think the biggest challenge in the world right now, at least particularly for on the development agenda, is finding the resources to deal with mitigation and mitigation of climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation in many developing countries. So, the world agreed basically recently, and they locked it in Cancun. The rich countries agreed we're going to spend $100 billion by a year by 2020. So where's the $100 billion going to come from? And one of the suggestions is a financial transactions tax. I don't think it's the best suggestion. I mean, the financial transactions tax is much criticized, as many of you will know, by economists because it could introduce distortions and so on. It would raise a lot of money. But in each country, that money would be locally held. And so if you're interested in raising money to deal with a global challenge or a development problem, then the financial transactions tax, if it ever were to happen in the US, which is completely unlikely politically, it would probably go to reducing the fiscal debt, not to dealing with the global challenge. So I, with colleagues, have said financial transactions tax not really a priority in terms of if you're going to decide on something that you want to push for. Instead, we would put priority on finding ways to use the special drawing rights that exist already at the IMF, which are a global asset. What that global asset does is it allows central bank governors in the world to sleep a little bit better at night. If there is a catastrophe on the financial side, they have these SDRs as sort of quasi-reserves that are held at the IMF. So what we have proposed is to take a small part of those SDRs, and if countries are willing, they would put them aside into a special account, and that would capitalize raising money on the bond market, for example, to assist countries on climate change mitigation. So that's a very long answer to say, I don't really have a view of the financial transactions tax in some abstract way. I wouldn't put it high on my agenda or on any development agenda. First, because it's totally unlikely ever to happen in the US, and without the US, you can't do it. You have to have total agreement on an FTT for it to work. And second, because it doesn't really fundamentally create a system that's likely to be able to access the resources for something that's global.
Okay. With that, let's turn it over to you guys for some questions. There are people here with microphones. Why don't you, after you're called on, rise, state your name, and ask a concise question. We'll try and get as many in. Yes, over here.
Get up below chairs. First of all, I want to say this is a very fascinating discussion. And Gideon, I want to congratulate you because I'd stopped reading Foreign Affairs until you became editor because I was tired of articles on NATO and the Israeli-Arab dispute. And these are the real issues we've been talking about. It seems to me that there are two issues which are not yet current in the U.S. debate. One of which is that there's broad agreement, as Nancy knows, in the fact that markets don't work unless there's strong governments, which are able to regulate markets. And the problem we've run into in the financial sector in one regard, and probably in the trade sector, is without a strong government, it's impossible to open up your economy and survive. And you can see that in all sorts of countries. So the argument seems to me that not the argument quite we're having here, but how do you design a trading system that allows countries both to regulate their own internal markets and at the same time participate in the international economy. Frankly, I think it's easier in finance than it is in trading. But for those of you who have not done it, you should read Danny Roderick's new book on this.
Thinking you were
which is
gonna
an
do the
excellent
Danny thing.
description of what you have to do, which is less globalization rather than more. So it seems to me that particularly you, Nancy, but also Susan, who's done an excellent job on this in this article, which I've actually read,
Thank you,
to at least get a Doha round, which does trade facilitation and the other things you suggest in the last 3 pages, and get rid of the Doha round that way and move on to how you deal with the emerging economies. I do want to say that the emerging economies do have very serious preference programs, most of which are at least as good as everything but arms. Not as good as AGOA, but everything but arms, and they should get credit for it.
We call that a council question.
I
Here's what
think
What do you
it's
think?
for Susan, isn't it?
Well, I should preface what I'm about to say by noting that John Sewell and the Overseas Development Council were the sources of most of what I learned about development policy when I was going through college, graduate school, and then subsequently when we had a chance to work together. And I am, as you note, a little more optimistic than you are. Part of it from conversations both with trade minister counterparts in the emerging markets when I was our trade minister. Part of it from sitting through lots and lots of bilateral summits between President Bush and Prime Minister Singh, Hu Jintao, and so on, and getting the sense that they really get it, even post global financial crisis. And that trade is a way of self-imposing reforms. Again, because you can show deliverables for your import-sensitive industries or your industries that are benefiting from trade-distorting subsidies. You can say, okay, we got to get rid of this because of this trade agreement is making me do it, but here's what I have instead. Or you say to this constituency, gee, I'm sorry, but you've got these 5 constituencies going, yeah, bring it on. So you can use your concessions and the reforms that you really should be doing unilaterally to get deliverables in the trade arena. So I see, and maybe because I've operated in the trade arena so long, I'm more of an optimist about it. One of the key challenges is the peer pressure, the developed versus developing. It's a very useful dichotomy right now for the emerging markets, but it's also a trap, and they recognize it's a trap. And are there ways in terms of launching the next multilateral set of activities that you can liberate those countries so they can do the things that they know that they should be doing? That may or may not extend to financial services liberalization.
I take your compliment, John, but I will say that I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Our next issue, which we're just putting to bed right now, has pieces by Michael Spence and Alan Taylor on globalization, by Peter Orzog and Stephen Ratner on American economic competitiveness, healthcare, and industrial policy, as well as a piece on NATO by Anders Fogh Rasmussen and a piece on the Israeli-Palestinian crisis by Elliot Abrams. So you can have all of the above. It's both and not either or. So yes, next question. Yes, back over here.
Whitney Schneidman Associates. It's been a very rich discussion, which has generated many questions in my mind. But let me keep it to one and pick up on a point that you made, Susan, regarding South Africa as emblematic of an emerging market that doesn't have incentives to deal. At USTR, you had many successes in negotiating trade agreements, but I think there was one that you didn't have, and I don't know if you were there then, but that was negotiating a free trade agreement with the South African Customs Union, in part because South Africa had no incentive to give up the unilateral access to the U.S. market. So my question is, does this not beg the point that when AGOA expires in 2015, we might want to suggest that to extend it with an emerging market like South Africa, we ask them to sign a most favored nation agreement. We begin to change the dynamic a little bit to get on a more equal level, to give them more of an incentive to deal with common markets.
I think you make a very good point. I would extend it to two things. One, just a note in terms of South Africa, which is during the Uruguay round, South Africa was treated or self-designated a developed country. And therefore, they undertook more trade liberalization in the Uruguay round in the 1990s than other developing countries. As a result, pardon me for the wonky stuff, their bound and applied tariff rates, like the Chinese, are very similar, which means that to the extent any country was going to be cutting industrial tariffs in the Doha round, under the Doha formula, in fact, South Africa would have had to do that. Just as China would have had to do that. But your broader point, I think, is right on target, which is the sort of the paradox of trade preferences and trade preference programs. I note today, I believe in Brussels, the European Union, the trade commissioner, was going to brief on revisions to their equivalent of our generalized system of preferences. John referred to it as everything but arms. Others refer to it as anything but farms.
Exactly.
Who knew trade people were so funny?
But the point being, you want to deliver preferences to the most needy developing countries. Do you want to include, in those preferences, you have Brazil getting, in terms of our preference program, Brazil gets GSP, India gets GSP. Should they be getting GSP? Now, we deal with it on a product-specific, country-specific basis. Are you competitive in this product? And if you are so competitive you don't need a preference, then you can be graduated from the program. But we've also, over the years, graduated Korea, Taiwan, Singapore were all at one point beneficiaries of the GSP program. But particularly with your emerging markets, you don't want to create the sort of perverse disinclination to negotiate a trade agreement, particularly since it has an impact on other developing countries as well.
Okay, so let's get a couple of questions together and keep the questions and answers concise so we can get as many as possible. In the back there and in the front here.
Thank you. Bill Lane with Caterpillar. Really, it's a two-part question. First one's to Nancy, and it gets back to the duty-free, quota-free issue. And my question is, where's the sense of outrage from the NGO community? I mean, when you look at Bangladesh, who we give $70 million a year in aid, and we collect $700 million a year in revenue from. You look at Cambodia, where the numbers are similar. Actually, Pakistan, the numbers are outrageous. But there's no call to action as far as actually doing something about it. And so, my question is, why isn't the NGO community coming to the rescue to save Doha? My same question goes to Sue as far as the business community is concerned. For many, many companies worldwide, they have no defensive issues. These companies and the employees that work for those companies only lose if there's no agreement. And whereas the popular statement is always no deal is I'd rather have no deal than a bad deal, for so much of commerce worldwide, no deal is a bad deal. So where is the outrage from business saying, let's conclude this, let's top off what we had in July of '08, and then let's move on after we actually have a fairly reasonable harvest?
And over here as well, let's bundle up too.
Hi, my name's John Gardenier. I have to admit to the most boring occupation in the world. I'm a statistical ethicist. But from that point of view, I wonder, there's been a lot of criticism, most notably by Stiglitz and his globalization and its discontents, about the metrics and the way of thinking about globalization, mainly that it doesn't put sufficient emphasis on Gini or the distribution of wealth. We tend to think of countries, and within country GDP. GDP averages the vast wealth of the upper tier and the utter abject poverty of the vast majority of the people. And if the GDP per capita looks pretty good, then we don't seem to care that much of the world is in a horrible situation, as Susan referred to earlier. I wonder, is there some way that we could modify the thinking and the metrics involved in this so that we incorporate the concept of Gini into our thinking about how fair trade agreements and financial agreements can be worked out?
Okay. Want to start with Pakistan and the outrage over?
Sure. I mean, Bill is absolutely right. I just can only repeat the question, where's the sense of outrage, particularly on this least developed country issue? As Bill knows very well, I share his outrage. Maybe there are some people here, I see a few, who might comment on why the NGO community hasn't picked up trade and opening markets in the advanced economies and in the new rising economies too, as Susan's been emphasizing, to the poorest. Why are we so quiet about the sort of distortion in biofuels? Why are we so quiet about what we do with sugar? I mean, we have a lot of problems ourselves. I think it would be great if we could get Bono, or Bob Geldof onto this agenda. So I can only...
They have in fact been on this agenda. They were at the G8 summit in Heiligendamm, for example, both of them, at the summit, pushing for Doha, among other things.
No, I mean that duty-free, quota-free access.
They were also pushing for that. They've been pushing for that, but after 10 years, there's a sort of a Doha fatigue, and a lot of people have sort of walked off the field.
Okay. Well, anyway, so let me say a word about
You
Pakistan.
need to get a new generation of stars.
Yeah,
Selena
a new
Gomez
generation. That's true. Shakira or something. So, on Pakistan, I think it's just we've been doing a lot of work on the U.S. development approach for Pakistan at the center. And one thing that is really striking to me is the huge benefits to American interests if we could allow a little bit better access to our market for Pakistanis. It raises all the issues Susan has raised about Cambodia and, preference erosion, and you can't go one country at a time. On the other hand, it's really in our national security interests to think about doing this. And we have very good work that shows it would have virtually no effect on U.S. jobs or U.S. production, virtually none. So the resistance to it, there has been some legislation proposed in some on the Hill, but the resistance to it is much more about this slippery slope and about the fear in general of trade and globalization. So let me say one word about Joe Stiglitz and income distribution. I think it's a really good point to have raised. I would say, however, that I'm a bit more of an optimist about the direction of things. The latest data show that in Latin America, for the first time, really, in a structural way, inequality is declining. In Brazil, in Chile, in Mexico. It's declining in other countries as well, in Peru. I hope that we'll start to see something like that in South Africa. And it's not unrelated to the point John Sewell was making, which is when you get governments that are a little bit more capable, a little bit more democratically accountable, as is the case in Latin America, as we would like to see in other parts of the world, of the developing world, you do start to see sensible social and economic policies that are married to the Washington Consensus, the good parts of the Washington Consensus, which were good macroeconomic fundamentals. You know, you deal with, you eliminate the worst privileges of the elite and so on and so on. And that's all has to do with the Arab Spring as well. That's what people want. They want some combination of opportunities that a market system provides with the kinds of protection that ensure that it's not just those who are already rich, already have insider privileges, already have access to finance that get ahead when you open your market, that there are mechanisms that government uses to ensure that others who don't initially have these endowments also have opportunities.
You want to chip in on that briefly?
A couple points.
Briefly.
Very briefly, amen to your comments about the NGO community. I would add the environmental community to that. There are a couple of very, very significant pro-environment provisions of the Doha round. One having to do with the elimination of subsidies to industrial fisheries and overfishing of the ocean. Talk to the EU, talk to China, talk to Japan. They are almost, with the exception of Oceania, they're nowhere to be found. Similarly, the development NGOs, it's just apparently politically incorrect for them to be pro-trade, and that's unfortunate.
This surprises you?
Well, I think it's a tragedy, but never mind. On to the question of the Gini coefficients, and clearly we need to be concerned about inequalities and the growing inequalities. I think, however, it is very hard not to find it a source of joy that hundreds of millions of people in the last 10 years have gone from 1 meal a day to 2 meals a day, in India and China.
Things are getting better.
Things are getting better.
It is working.
They may be getting better faster for certain strata, but hundreds of millions of people have benefited. And if you go to some of the data from the 1990s, developing countries that opened their markets in the 1990s grew 3 times faster than developing countries that didn't open their markets.
We're going to, since we started a little bit late, we're going to run a little bit late, but we'll take the final 2 questions and batch them together. Here and here.
Not so much a question, but just...
Hold on 1 second, wait for the mic. State your name and affiliation.
Bennett Freeman, Calvert Group, but really speaking in my capacity as having been on the board of Oxfam America for 8 years until a couple months ago. And I just want to say, at least with respect to Oxfam, and not just Oxfam America, but Oxfams around the world, did engage strongly and consistently in the Doha round from beginning now to bitter end, with the view of increasing trade, but on reasonable terms so that the poorest countries could compete in markets like the United States. But it wasn't just an effort to push Doha. It was an effort here in the US to end some of the worst distortions in our own agricultural subsidies, particularly with respect to cotton, in order to allow poor farmers, say, from African countries to export on some kind of competitive basis here to the U.S. So at least for Oxfam, there has been a concerted effort here, and I just want to make that very clear. Thank you.
I should endorse that, because we gave from the center our award. We have a Commitment to Development award, and we gave it to the Make Trade Fair campaign of Oxfam about 4 or 5 years ago. And I got a lot of trouble from Jagdish Bhagwati over that.
I would like to, no, I'm sorry, I need to quibble slightly with, there's a big difference between positions taken by Oxfam America and Oxfam International on trade. And it would be wonderful in the interest, take cotton as a for example, if Oxfam International were as active in pushing China to eliminate its 40% tariff on cotton as it has been to get the U.S. to eliminate our trade distorting subsidies on cotton, which, by the way, are on the table in Geneva. So,
point taken.
Okay. Last question over here.
I'm Arturo Porsekansky with American University, and I do have a question. The spotlight has been so much on China, India, and Brazil, countries that are quite not ready to take up their share of the responsibility in leadership in these areas, whether the development agenda or the trade agenda. But we forget there is good old Russia. Now, there's an ambitious country, and they're not even in the WTO yet. Is there any way we could, you could conceive of some kind of a grand bargain to bring in Russia and move some of these topics forward?
Any thoughts on Russia?
I'll offer just two observations. One, I did not want, and I don't think either of us want to leave the impression that all developing countries and all emerging economies are against being more open on trade. There are some key leaders in the emerging markets that are trying to get a more ambitious Doha outcome. So Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Malaysia, Thailand occasionally, but a variety of countries that have been, Turkey I mentioned earlier, Pakistan I mentioned, proactive, trying to get an ambitious outcome. Russia obviously is not there. I like to think Russia is very close to finally getting into the WTO. You don't get into the WTO until you're willing to behave like a WTO member. We're getting to that point, I think, with Russia. And it will be very, very interesting to see when Russia is in the WTO what kind of role Russia chooses to take.
The hallmark of a good panel, like a good vacation, is that you wish it could only last longer, but you know you have to go home. So we're going to end this now, but we are going to be outside for a little bit of time afterwards, and you can ask some of you some questions there. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank all of our participants. I want to thank DevEx again for helping sponsor it. Thank you.